The 10,045th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threat to international peace and security, conflict-related food insecurity. The agenda is adopted. Before each of you is a list of speakers who have requested to participate in accordance with Rule 37 and 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure. We propose that they be invited to participate in this meeting. There being no objection,
it is so decided.
The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2025/688, a letter dated 28 October 2025 from the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General. I warmly welcome the Deputy Secretary General, Her Excellency Ms. Amina J. Mohammed, and give her the floor.
Thank you. His Excellency Julius Maada, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellency, colleagues, thank you for convening this debate. I commend the Republic of Sierra Leone for placing conflict-related food insecurity squarely where it belongs, at the center of this Council's agenda. Sierra Leone brings profound understanding to this debate. When you have lived through conflict's devastation, you know with absolute clarity that war destroys more than infrastructure. It destroys the ability to feed your children and your communities. Excellencies, war and hunger are often two faces of the same crises. They are a lived reality for hundreds of millions trapped in conflict zones, which bears this out with brutal clarity. Bullets and bombs obliterate the fields where food grows, the markets where people trade, the roads that connect farmers to families. And hunger strikes back with equal force. Empty bellies fuel desperation. Desperation fuels displacement and violence, and the result is instability and often the destruction of the very systems that produce food. This Council's mandate is maintenance of international peace and security, and there can be neither peace where people are starving nor security where hunger drives conflict. The evidence is irrefutable. Armed conflict drives acute food security in 14 of the 16 hunger hotspots worldwide. Last year, 295 million people faced acute hunger, 14 million more than the year before. The number of people experiencing catastrophic hunger has more than doubled to 1.9 million. In Sudan, the world's largest hunger crisis, violence is perpetuating famine across Darfur and Kordofan. In Gaza, where famine was confirmed in August, the situation remains severe. Across Haiti, Yemen, and the Sahel, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, millions remain trapped in a vicious cycle of hunger and conflict. Borders offer no protection from these consequences. We live in an interconnected world where conflict in one region sends shockwaves across continents. The war in Europe disrupted grain exports that triggered food crises across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Markets panicked, inflation soared, and millions went hungry. As we saw in this instance once and again, the poorest pay the ultimate price. This is the new arithmetic of conflict. When food systems are attacked, weaponized, the impact is global. Food itself has become a weapon. Through deliberate starvation tactics, which we are seeing all too often, including recently in Gaza, but also through the systematic destruction of agricultural systems, through blockades that strangle supply, through the calculated disruption of trade flows that leaves entire regions vulnerable. The mechanics are devastating and a violation of international humanitarian law. Arms are looted and wells are poisoned. Grain stores are burned and processing facilities destroyed. Roads that connect farmers to markets are blocked. Nomadic communities disrupted as livestock is rustled and often destroyed. The infrastructure that makes food systems work is targeted. And in a spiral of death, we continue to invest in military expenditure rather than putting an end to hunger. The world's total military expenditure over the past decade estimated at $21.9 trillion, yet ending hunger by 2030 would cost us much less, $93 billion a year. Then there is climate change, accelerating this crisis with deadly force. Floods wash away harvests, droughts turn fields into dust, and rising temperatures devastate grazing lands. The predictable seasons farmers relied on for millennia are also disrupted. Many of the countries most vulnerable to climate stand in the shadow of conflict, and this is not a coincidence. I saw this firsthand as Nigeria's Minister of Environment. When Lake Chad began drying up, what we faced was never just an ecological or economic crisis. It was one of governance and security that helped give rise to Boko Haram. When population growth and urban sprawl intensified tensions between farmers and herders over shrinking resources, the issue was never simply about water access. It was about food systems under stress and communities pushed to breaking point. When I meet girls walking each day to fetch water, missing school in the process, it became clear to me that the challenge went far beyond resources. It touched gender inequality, education, and the future of entire communities, putting the entire Agenda 2030 at risk. Excellencies, we cannot and must not accept these examples as the new normal. The hunger conflict nexus is a strategic and existential threat, and this Council must treat it as such. We need 4 actions. First, humanitarian access must flow, ceasefires must hold, and international humanitarian law must be upheld. The obstruction, delays, and excuses that have characterized too many conflicts must end. We see the consequences in Sudan and in Gaza, where humanitarian access remains severely restricted, even as famine takes hold. Food systems that should sustain civilian populations have become battlegrounds. Humanitarian workers must reach people in need, and food systems must be protected as the civilian infrastructure they represent, farms, markets, transport routes, and storage facilities that serve as lifelines rather than legitimate targets. Resolutions 2417 and 2573, which this body adopted in 2018 and 2021 respectively, give us the framework by condemning starvation as a method of warfare, demanding protection of civilians, and requiring unimpeded humanitarian access. Years later, crises are more devastating than ever. What we need is enforcement. That means broadening engagement beyond governments to include civil society organizations that witness conditions on the ground, regional actors who understand local dynamics, and national partners who possess the leverage the international community often lacks. We must work with all of them to drive implementation and demand accountability for violations. Ceasefires and humanitarian pauses serve as strategic necessities for protecting the food systems people depend on. When parties facilitate access, instead of weaponizing denial, they create space for recovery, for peace, and pathways to sustainability. Second, the path from fragility to resilience runs through sustainable food systems. Building them requires a fundamental shift from short-term relief to long-term transformation, and from emergency response to strategic investments, as I recently reinforced in the call to action coming out of the UN food system stocktake in Ethiopia. Achieving the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals demands this transformation, and we cannot end hunger, build resilient communities, or secure peace without it. While hunger fuels violence and displacement, resilient systems can break that cycle. When smallholder farmers thrive, local economies grow. When food systems connect to health, education, and social protection, they do become a foundation for stability. This means strengthening local markets so communities can access affordable, nutritious food, building storage facilities that protect harvests, processing infrastructure that adds value, ensuring that women and young people have ownership and decision-making power over the systems that feed their families and communities. The African Union's CAADP framework, renewed just this year through the Kampala Declaration, demonstrates this commitment in action, with African countries pledging to increase agri-food by 45% and triple intra-Africa trade while building climate resilience. Leads me to my third point. Climate action stands as an essential pillar of both food security and peace. As the Secretary General told world leaders at COP30, keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees is slipping from our grasp. Even a brief overshoot risks pushing natural systems past the point of no return, exposing billions to worsening hunger while intensifying the very threats to peace and security that this Council is charged with preventing. Ensuring early warning systems reach every person is also non-negotiable. We must deliver adaptation finance at scale so communities can manage resources, build resilience, and prevent climate stress from igniting conflict. When farmers have drought-resistant seeds and water management systems, when communities have the tools to adapt, they can weather shocks instead of breaking under them. Investing in climate adaptation today prevents hunger tomorrow. Fourth, peace is the only sustainable solution. Humanitarian action saves lives today, but it cannot end war. Only political solutions can do that. Achieving lasting peace requires treating food, agriculture, and humanitarian access as strategic imperatives. That means governments, donors, and implementers working with humanitarian development peace nexus to tackle root causes of conflict, not just their symptoms. Prevention demands early investment. If we wait for famine declarations to mobilize resources, we have already failed. People have already died, and early action saves lives, protects livelihoods, and costs far less than the crisis response. But prevention also requires addressing exclusion, inequality, and the systemic absence of state services that create conditions for conflict. When governments cannot deliver basic services, when marginalization deepens, when people lose hope, grievances multiply, and food insecurity becomes one more accelerant on the fire. This is where the nexus approach becomes essential. Thank you. We cannot address food security without addressing the root causes of conflict. We cannot build peace without ensuring people can feed themselves. And we cannot achieve sustainable development without tackling both at the same time. Excellencies, as an old East African proverb teaches us, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. Today, that grass, the innocent civilians around the world, Sudan, Gaza, Haiti, Yemen, and the Sahel, the DRC, so many other places, are suffering beyond measure. They're paying the price for conflicts they did not choose, or for decisions in which they have no voice. This Council has both the authority and the responsibility to act. Let us choose to build a future where food is never again used as a weapon, where no child goes hungry because of war, and where food systems become engines of peace, resilience, and hope, rather than casualties of a conflict. I thank you.
I thank the Deputy Secretary General for her briefing. And I'll give the floor to Ms. Joyce Msuya.
Thank you, Excellency President Bio, for this opportunity to speak on the critical issue of conflict-induced hunger. The evidence from the latest Hunger Hotspots report from the Global Network Against Food Crisis is clear. The world's most extreme food crisis, including the famines in parts of the Gaza Strip and Sudan, are driven primarily by armed conflict and violence. In South Sudan, the risk of famine persists in some counties affected by localized violence. The more intense the violence, the worse the food insecurity. Attacks harming civilians and civilian infrastructure leave fields abandoned, disrupt food supply chains, drive up prices, and destroy livelihoods. In Yemen, where 17 million people are going hungry and another 1 million are forecast to, damage to infrastructure has impeded imports. Ongoing conflict is displacing people and exacerbating economic decline, while extreme humanitarian access constraints and insecurity limit aid delivery in critical parts of the country. In Syria, agricultural production has been severely affected by damaged infrastructure, restricted access to farmland due to explosive ordnance, and high levels of displacement. Hunger is exposing people to greater risks of sexual exploitation and abuse and forced displacement as people struggle simply to feed themselves. Women are especially impacted, often going without to prioritize their families. In armed conflicts, international humanitarian law is clear. Civilians and civilian objects must be protected. The use of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited. So is attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless objects indispensable to civilian survival. Resolution 2417, adopted in 2018, reinforces these obligations. And in situations of violence in which the rules of war don't apply, international human rights law and minimum humanitarian standards play an equally vital role in preventing and addressing hunger. Humanitarian action is also essential to prevent and address hunger in conflict. When humanitarian access is denied, hunger and malnutrition rise, often with devastating consequences for civilians. Conflict parties must allow the rapid and unimpeded passage of impartial humanitarian relief and ensure humanitarians have the freedom of movement needed to carry out their work. Resolution 2417, as well as Resolution 2730, adopted last year, reiterate these duties. 1 month into the ceasefire in Gaza, the UN and our partners are seizing every opening to save lives. Millions of meals have been provided, nutrition sites have reopened, and some medical services have resumed, among other progress. But access is still restricted by limits at border crossings, delays to aid convoys, and bureaucratic impediments that slow the entry of vital supplies and, in some cases, staff. In Sudan, conflict has shattered food systems and displaced millions. According to the latest IPC analysis, more than 21 million people are facing high levels of acute food insecurity, the largest such crisis in the world. Yet many areas remain inaccessible to humanitarians. People trapped between front lines are cut off from assistance and enduring extreme hunger. The UN, including OCHA, works relentlessly to secure humanitarian access. We negotiate with parties to conflict, operate notification systems to inform armed actors about humanitarian movements, and coordinate responders on the ground. But these tools can only work if parties are committed to facilitate access and aid operations. The record number of attacks harming aid workers over the past 2 years and the knock-on effect on communities' access to relief is appalling. I call on states to condemn these attacks and push for consistent, credible investigations in every context. Reducing bureaucratic hurdles also facilitates access, simplifying entry procedures for humanitarian staff, speeding up permits for relief supplies, and enabling safe movement. Clearance of unexploded ordnance is another practical enabler, allowing aid to reach people safely and helping farmers return to their land. And humanitarian funding remains essential to sustain operations. Finally, without political will, even the best coordination, negotiation, and funding will fall short. Preventing and ending hunger is not simply a logistical or financial challenge. It demands sustained political engagement. I want to propose 4 areas of action for this Council and UN member states. First, use your leverage to address hunger and conflict. This means sustained political dialogue and diplomatic engagement and using tools at your disposal to influence parties. As part of that, making compliance with international law a condition for arms exports is essential. Second, adopt strong policies and practices to protect civilians. Alongside implementing their legal obligations, we encourage member states to join commitments such as the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and turning those commitments into real action. Third, facilitate humanitarian action by simplifying bureaucratic procedures and ensuring humanitarians can engage all parties. Implement Security Council Resolution 2730 on the protection of aid workers, including the practical steps outlined by the Secretary General. Fourth, strengthen accountability, demand and support investigations, adopt legislation to prosecute war crimes, enhance interstate cooperation, and where competent national authorities are unable or unwilling to act, support international jurisdictions. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Musuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Maximo Torero.
Thank you very much, President. At outset, I wish to thank His Excellency, the President of Sierra Leone, for convening this timely and important open debate on conflict-related food insecurity, addressing food insecurity as a driver and a consequence of conflict, and for inviting the FAO to contribute to the discussion. Mr. President, around the world, nearly 673 million people still go to bed hungry. In Africa, 307 million men and women and children lack of sufficient food. In Asia, the number rises to 323 million, while in Latin America and Caribbean, 34 million face undernourishment. These are not abstract statistics. They represent children whose growth is stunted, families forced to leave their homes, and nations whose social fabric is under strain. More and more, hunger and instability go hand in hand. Food insecurity is no longer just a humanitarian challenge. It is a matter of global peace and security. When families cannot afford to eat, social contracts weaken. When farmers lose their crops to droughts or floods and conflicts or wars, local markets falter and tensions flare. When international food prices spike or price volatility becomes excessive, protesters erupt in cities from Port-au-Prince to Cairo, and rigorous empirical research confirms this. Higher global food prices and excessive volatility are directly associated with more social unrest events, with effects strongest in poorer countries and in urban settings. For over 2 decades, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, together with its partners, has been at the forefront of global efforts to shape evidence-based responses to food insecurity, particularly in the world's more fragile and conflict-affected settings. It's in this context, and in the need to have neutral assessments and neutral data, that the Integrated Food Security Peace Classification, or IPC, was first developed by FAO in 2004 in Somalia. At the time, the need for a robust, consensus-driven, and actionable food security measurement tool was clear. Humanitarian actors require reliable information to guide effective response in a complex and volatile environment. What began as a country-specific tool has since evolved into a global standard serving as a common currency for food security and nutrition analysis in emergency contexts. The IPC now provides comparable findings in over 30 countries, many of which are facing the world's most severe food crises, such as Gaza, South Sudan, Sudan, and Yemen. When combined with the Cadre Harmonisé, a similar analytical framework used in 17 countries across West Africa and the Sahel, their combined coverage extends to nearly 50 countries globally. Designed to generate actionable knowledge in difficult contexts, these tools collectively inform over $6 billion in humanitarian assistance each year, guiding strategic decisions and resource allocation in some of the most complex and high-risk environments. Today, the IPC Global Initiative, hosted by FAO, brings together 21 international and intergovernmental institutions, including UN agencies, regional organizations, and NGOs. These partners work collectively to ensure the technical quality, neutrality, and comparability of food security and nutrition analysis in the emergency context in which they are applied. How does this work? Based on careful analysis of all variable information, the IPC framework assigns geographic areas into one of 5 phases of acute food insecurity and of acute malnutrition, based on the most severe conditions faced by at least 20% of the population. Phase 1 corresponds to minimal or no food insecurity, while Phase 5, famine, is the most extreme category, indicating catastrophic conditions marked by starvation, destitution, extreme levels of acute malnutrition, and elevated mortality. IPC is now the primary mechanisms the international community to determine whether famine is happening or projected to occur in a country. The IPC process ensures the highest quality and neutrality of food insecurity classifications through a rigorous standardized system built on cross-validation of multiple data sources and expert technical consensus. All evidence used must meet the strict IPC methodological criteria, and datasets are systematically triangulated, combining food security, nutrition, livelihoods, market, and climate indicators to confirm consistency and reliability. A multi-agency team of government specialists, FAO, WFP, UNICEF, NGOs, and independent experts jointly review and validate the evidence, ensuring that the classifications reflect a convergence of robust, independently verified information. Finally, regional and global IPC quality assurance teams conduct an additional layer of review before results are released, guaranteeing that every classification is grounded in sound, cross-checked data and expert validation. When an IPC analysis in a country indicates a situation of famine, an ad hoc dedicated procedure is triggered to rigorously assess the plausibility of the conclusion. At this stage, the Famine Review Committee, or the FRC, is convened. This is a group of highly respected independent experts in food security, nutrition, and public health. The FRC role is to examine the available evidence, debate the findings, and ensure that analysis meets the highest standards of technical rigor, integrity, and neutrality. Only after this review is a famine classification confirmed and communicated. This process is essential to maintaining trust in IPC results, especially in politically sensitive environments. In the current context of escalating conflict and fragility and shrinking humanitarian funding that drives geographic and sectoral prioritization, the IPC is more critical than ever and must not only be supported but protected as a cornerstone of evidence-based decision-making. Just in the past year, the Famine Review Committee has confirmed famine on separate occasions, twice in Sudan, December 2024, November 2025, and once in Gaza, August 2025. The first time that famine driven by conflict has been confirmed more than once in a single year. When famine is confirmed, the IPC provides critical evidence that decision makers need to act. Along its findings, the Famine Review Committee issues a set of targeted recommendations addressed to key stakeholders. These include recommended action for senior decision makers and resource partners, which must be considered to swift implementation through existing humanitarian and diplomatic mechanisms. But we can all agree waiting for a famine to happen to make a decisive action is far too late. In both Sudan and Gaza, the IPC had already issued early warning signals, calling for immediate actions to prevent the worst outcomes. These warnings were delivered in 2 ways. First, by projecting or forecasting famine within a defined future period based on most likely scenario, and second, by issuing risk famine statements grounded in alternative worst-case scenarios. These warnings offer a critical window of opportunity, first for humanitarian diplomacy, for secure access to affected populations, and second, to respond to critical needs before conditions deterioration further. The IPC is not just a technical tool, it is a lifeline for the millions of people living in the front lines of conflict and hunger. It provides the international community with the clarity and credibility needed to act decisively, especially in the most complex environments. The recent confirmations of famine are stark reminders that conflict continues to drive food insecurity and malnutrition to catastrophic levels. The lesson is clear. Where there is hunger, there will be unrest. Where there is resilience, there can be peace. Global leaders must treat food security as a peace dividend and not afterthought. If we are serious about preventing conflict, we must be serious about ensuring that every person in every country has access to affordable, nutritious, and healthy food. Food insecurity not only is a moral imperative, it is the most practical path to peace. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Toreru for his briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Dr. Ibrahim Hassan Mayaki.
Your Excellency Julius Maada, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, distinguished members of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am grateful for the opportunity to brief the Council on the escalating food and nutrition crisis across Africa. But I would like to start by mentioning the fact that Sierra Leone is one of the best examples that we have of food systems transformation on the continent. My intervention will address three critical dimensions: the overall scale of the crisis, its most acute manifestations in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Sahel, and the urgent measures required to prevent a deeper humanitarian and security emergency. Africa has become the epicenter of global hunger, with 20.4% of its population food insecure, twice the global average. By 2030, over half of the world's hungry will reside on the continent. The global report on food crisis cites 295 million acutely food insecure people across 53 countries, nearly half driven by conflict. This marks the 6th year of rising hunger fueled by conflict, climate shocks, economic fragility, and systemic vulnerabilities. Sudan faces one of Africa's gravest food emergencies. 25.6 million people, 54% of the population, are acutely food insecure. Over 8 million are in phase 4 emergency, and 800,000 are in phase 5 famine, marking Sudan's first confirmed famine. The crisis is driving mass displacement into Chad, South Sudan, and the Horn of Africa. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, 25.6 million people were acutely food insecure in 2024, with conditions worsening. Violence in the east has destroyed farms and displaced millions. The crisis costs an estimated $8 billion annually in lost productivity and weakened human capital, threatening stability across the Great Lakes. The Sahel is experiencing its worst food crisis on record. Nigeria now has 31.8 million acutely food insecure people, with 6.9 million newly affected. Chad's caseload rose 47% due to conflict, floods, and inflation. Chronic malnutrition costs Sahelian economies between 2 and 3% of GDP annually, eroding state capacity and reinforcing fragility. Climate and economic shocks are deepening the crisis. Africa has lost 34% of agricultural productivity since 1961 and suffers 35% of global death from extreme weather, yet only 40% of Africans have access to early warning systems. Meanwhile, humanitarian funding is falling. Food sector support dropped 30% in 2023, with further cuts in 2024. Mr. President, the link between conflict and hunger in Africa is profound and mutually reinforcing. I respectfully offer three overarching priorities for the Council's consideration. First, food systems must be protected as essential civilian infrastructure under international humanitarian law. Agricultural land, water sources, markets, and storage facilities must be safeguarded. At the same time, humanitarian access must be guaranteed. Localized ceasefires during planting and harvest seasons, along with the expansion of protected humanitarian corridors, are critical to sustaining food production and averting famine. Second, early warning and conflict prevention systems must integrate food security indicators, particularly those from the integrated food security phase classification and regional tools to enable timely diplomatic engagement and targeted response. Emergency assistance must also be paired with long-term investment in resilient agri-food systems, with a focus on empowering women and youth who are central to African food production. Third, international financing must align with Africa's strategic vision, the Kampala Declaration, endorsed by all African Union member states, which commits to increasing agri-food output by 45%, tripling intra-African trade, reducing malnutrition by 25%, and ensuring that 60% of Africans can afford a healthy diet and halving extreme poverty by 2035. These ambitions require peace, partnership, and sustained global commitment. Mr. President, the cost of hunger in Africa is not only counted in numbers, it is felt in broken lives, uprooted communities, and lost futures. Malnutrition alone drains over $25 billion annually from African economies. Without urgent actions, millions more will face catastrophic hunger and entire regions risk irreversible decline. Africa has the vision and resolve to transform its food systems, but peace and global solidarity are essential. Without peace, Africa cannot feed itself, and without food security, peace cannot be sustained. I thank you, and thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Dr. Mayaki for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. Madam Deputy Secretary General, distinguished members of the Security Council, I'm pleased to return to this historic chamber for the second time in 2 years during Sierra Leone's tenure on the Council to address an issue that tests our shared humanity and global stability, conflict-related insecurity, food insecurity. Last year, we discussed reforming this council to make it more representative. Today, we discuss how to make it more responsive, because even a reformed council without moral standing will not preserve peace. Sierra Leone's own history has taught us that peace is not inherited. It is cultivated, season by season, through peaceful settlement of dispute, justice, and equality. And today, as we gather under this roof of our multilateral collective security scheme, we must remember that hunger, too, is a form of violence. Slow, silent, and corrosive. I thank Her Excellency the Deputy Secretary General, Madam Amina Mohammed, Assistant Secretary General Joyce Musuya, Dr. Ibrahim Hassan Mayaki, and Mr. Maximo Torero Kulen for their thoughtful briefings and for the leadership they continue to provide in addressing global food systems and humanitarian coordination. Distinguished members of the Security Council, the Charter of the United Nations begins with a promise to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That mandate extends beyond ending wars to preventing the conditions that make wars inevitable. As a former UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld warned us, our task is, and I quote, to save humanity from hell. In our century, that hell is not only found in the battlefields, it is found in the empty bowl, the barren field, and the malnourished child. Conflict situations around the world and the images that fill our screens and newspapers must convict us out of global complicity. Emaciated infants clinging to life, mothers whose bodies can no longer produce milk, fathers unable to provide a single meal for their families, and children who brave siege and bombardment in search of food, only to lose their lives to unexploded ordnance, are not distant tragedies. They are moral failures of our collective humanity. From Gaza to Sahel, from Sudan to Ukraine, and in parts of Haiti, hunger has been weaponized. A silent siege that kills long after the guns fall silent. It corrodes social cohesion, fuels displacement, and when combined with exclusion and despair, can ignite instability. In Africa, the world's youngest region, where over 60% of the population is under 25, rising expectations without opportunity or nourishment can quickly turn hope into unrest. This is why Sierra Leone has called for this debate, to affirm that food security is peace security, not a secondary humanitarian issue. Distinguished members of the Security Council, I wish to highlight 3 main points. My first point, starvation is not collateral damage. It is a crime. International law prohibits the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. Resolution 2417 condemns its use. Resolution 2573 demands the protection of agricultural land, water, and energy infrastructure indispensable to civilian survival. The Geneva Convention and the Rome Statute classify deliberate starvation as a war crime. The framework exists. What is lacking is compliance and enforcement. This Council must ensure unimpeded humanitarian access, predictable deconfliction mechanisms, and the removal of blockades and bureaucratic impediments that turn hunger into a weapon. Early warning systems must track conflict disruption, production, storage, market, and transport so that early warning leads to early action. The Black Sea Grain Initiative demonstrated that dialogue, even amid conflict, can sustain vital supply lines. Above all, there must be accountability. When civilians are deliberately starved, perpetrators, state or non-state, must face consequences. No ambition can justify starving a child or destroying a harvest. The law forbids it. Our conscience forbids it too. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my second point is that food insecurity must be viewed through the lens of a driver of conflict, as well as a peace-building imperative. Conflict destroys food systems. Faiths are mined or burned, livestock stolen or lost, roads and ports are blocked, markets are shuttered, prices spike beyond reach, while hunger deepens grievance and fuels renewed violence. This cruel cycle is evident in Sudan, the Sahel, Eastern DRC, Gaza, Yemen, and Haiti, where food insecurity has reached catastrophic levels. There can be no sustainable peace on an empty stomach. Food insecurity must therefore be integral to peace building, not an afterthought. Peace agreements must protect food systems and guarantee humanitarian access. Post-conflict recovery must restore livelihoods through seeds, tools, feeder routes, and access to markets. Women and youth must be central to this transformation as producers, traders, and innovators, because when families can plant, harvest, and sell in peace, reconciliation becomes real and durable. Distinguished members of the Security Council, my third point, which relates to peace and development nexus, and as President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, I bring to this agenda our own national experience. Our Feeds Alone initiative, as both a local model and a regional contribution to the global pursuit of peace through food security. Sierra Leone's experience teaches that peace must be fed, literally and figuratively, every season. Our flagship national development initiative, Feeds Alone, places food security at the heart of national development. It aims to raise productivity, reduce import dependence, create rural jobs, and build climate resilience. The program stands on 4 pillars. First is production, which involves access to seeds, mechanization, irrigation, and research. The second pillar is resilience, focusing on climate-smart practices and land restoration. The third pillar is market and value chains, involving rural infrastructure, processing, and finance. The fourth pillar is human capital, which involves empowering women and youth, improving nutrition, and linking protection to productivity. Our goal is not merely to grow food, but to grow peace, putting livelihoods into people's hands, dignity in their homes, and hope in their communities. Sierra Leone is also advancing regional cooperation on early warning, strategic reserves, and trade facilitation so that grain can move when people need it, where people need it most. As chair of ECOWAS, authority of heads of state and government, Sierra Leone's voice carries the shared aspiration of a region determined to transform its challenges into opportunities. From the Sahel to the Atlantic, ECOWAS member states are integrating food security into peace building, climate adaptation, and trade frameworks. The ECOWAS Regional Food Security Reserve and our early warning and response network are being expanded to anticipate crises, coordinate humanitarian corridors, and stabilize markets. These efforts are part of a continental commitment under the African Union Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program and the Malabo Declaration on Agricultural Transformation. We commend the United Nations agencies, international financial institutions, and private sector partners whose innovation and investment continue to sustain millions. Together, we must now move from fragmented responses to a coordinated global food security compact. Excellencies, intentions must now become implementation. I propose 6 concrete actions as part of a solution-driven approach. Protect food systems in conflict. Integrate protection of civilian food assets, such as fields, herds, storage facilities, mills, and sources of water and energy for agriculture into council mandates and sanction regimes. Have standard language in council documents, mandates, and sanction criteria. The council must also ensure the implementation and compliance with its resolution, including 2417. Institutionalize early warning. This requires regular, integrated UN reporting on the impact of conflict on food systems and humanitarian access, enabling the Council to act before famine occurs. 3, safeguard access and deconfliction mechanisms. Condemn and sanction the obstruction of humanitarian relief, as well as the diversion and deliberate withholding of food aid as a tactic of war. Support predictable, needs-based humanitarian corridors and ensure deconfliction. 4, advance accountability. Promote impartial investigations into starvation crimes. Support the integration of starvation prohibition into domestic law. And when appropriate, allow accountability measures to proceed. 5, link peace-building finance to food security. Ensure that peace-building strategies and financing instruments prioritize livelihoods, rural infrastructure, and climate-smart agriculture as essential peace dividends rather than optional extras. 6, and lastly, promote women and youth empowerment by supporting programs that finance land tenure, access to finance, skills training, and market opportunities for young agricultural entrepreneurs, transforming potential conflict into foundations of stability. Excellencies, starvation is never a natural outcome of conflict. It is a choice to break the law and betray our shared humanity. This Council has the duty to deter that choice and to hold violators to account. Sierra Leone's voice in this Council is that of a nation that has journeyed from fragility to stability, and of a region that continues to choose dialogue over division. As President of Sierra Leone, I've witnessed the power of principled engagement, even in difficult times. We may not always have the same interest, but we must always defend the same humanity that we all share. Africa is not here to be pitied for its challenges, but to be partnered for its solutions. Our continent holds 60% of the world's arable land, the youngest population, and the greatest potential for innovation in sustainable agriculture. What we need is not sympathy, but solidarity to unlock Africa's power to feed itself and to help feed the world. Preventing tomorrow's war requires treating food security as central to peace and security, not peripheral to it. Sierra Leone will continue to do its part through Feed Salon at home, through ECOWAS in our region, and through principled bridge-building leadership in this council. Let us reaffirm faith in the multilateral system as the only credible platform to prevent starvation, uphold international law, and preserve our shared humanity. Together, let us ensure that no child is starved into submission, no harvest held hostage, and no community driven to violence by hunger. If we align our laws with our conscience, our mandates with the needs of people, and our resources with the scale of the challenge, we will redeem the Charter's promise to succeeding generations. Let us plant the seeds of justice, water them with compassion, and guard them with courage so that peace may take root not only in our resolutions, but in the daily lives of those we serve. For peace is not a season. It is a covenant we must renew with every act of humanity. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Well, thank you to Sierra Leone for convening the Council today for this open debate, and it is especially an honor to have President Maada presiding today over the Council. Welcome, sir. Colleagues, the United States remains deeply alarmed by the rise in conflict-related food insecurity and, frankly, the very grim picture of severe food insecurity in many nations and many regions around the world. As we look around the world, we see over and over again oppressive regimes and their militaries, as well as terrorist groups and other non-state actors, destroying farms, destroying equipment, as well as blocking major trade routes and the humanitarian pipelines that are lifelines for hungry people. The result is increased food insecurity and increasingly amounts of people starving. This must be stopped, colleagues. We must hold those responsible accountable for their actions. And just looking around the world, for example, in the DRC, armed violence, particularly in the east, continues to displace families, continues to destroy fields, continues to disrupt trade. Millions remain food insecure as armed groups attack civilians, block humanitarian routes, and undermine the ability of communities to buy or cultivate their own food. In Sudan, the world's largest humanitarian crisis, Starvation has become a weapon. Starvation has become rampant as the parties use food as a tactic of war. All parties, and I emphasize all parties to the conflict, must facilitate and allow rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access throughout Sudan. In Haiti, active humanitarian and life-saving assistance continues to support families and children impacted and terrorized by gang violence. The same type of humanitarian assistance are helping families that have been devastated recently by Hurricane Melissa, and all of those suffering from all forms of food insecurity. Programming focuses on Haiti's complex situation, providing life-saving assistance and rapid relief to communities, again, affected so horribly by gang violence and other forms of natural disasters. The United States has improved food security by supporting over 90,000 people with food, water, sanitation, shelter, and health services, hopefully paving the way for a better future for Haiti and for Haitians. In Gaza, President Trump's historic 20-point peace plan has already resulted in increased humanitarian aid to the people there. The United States will continue to work with the international community, with the UN, with so many nations represented here today, to deliver aid at scale to help those who need it the most. But just as an important statistic, in fiscal year 2025, the U.S. government provided over $400 million in life-saving humanitarian assistance inside the West Bank and Gaza, of which over $300 million was for life-saving food and nutrition assistance. President Trump's peace agreement has resulted in a dramatic increase in the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. An average now of over 660 trucks are entering Gaza daily since the ceasefire, and we will continue to work to deliver this aid at scale. The war in Ukraine has continued to exacerbate food insecurity globally, and it underscores the far-reaching and long-lasting consequences of war on people's basic needs and their basic ability to feed their family. Unfortunately, colleagues, these are just a handful of countries and regions that are facing this scourge. The United States has proven again and again to be the most generous nation in the world. The American people contribute over $500 billion in life-saving aid to charitable causes around the world, many of which help feed the hungry. The United States has long shouldered the financial burden of addressing this scourge, and we urge other donors to increase critically needed assistance. But ultimately, the Deputy Secretary General who joins us today is absolutely right. As she just said, only political solutions can lead to peace. Only political solutions can drive this scourge into the dustbin of history. And the United States will remain absolutely committed to driving these political solutions home so that we never again have to see these hungry families that we've all described and that we pity here today. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to express my appreciation to Your Excellency, President Pio, and for convening this important high-level open debate on the conflict-related food insecurity. I also want to express my gratitude to the Deputy Secretary General, Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, ASG, Ms. Misuya, and Dr. Mayaki, and Mr. Torero for their valuable contributions. Today's discussion underscores a complex but undeniable truth. While conflict and hunger are often interlinked, the relationship is not uniform. Armed conflicts remain one of the leading drivers of acute food insecurity, yet food insecurity itself can exacerbate fragility, deepen inequality, and undermine peace-building efforts. The Security Council's engagement, particularly through Resolution 2417 of 2018, has been instrumental in recognizing that hunger, when it's used as a weapon or allowed to persist, can pose a significant threat to international peace and security. Yet, as 2025 Global Report on Food Crisis notes, the number of people facing severe food insecurity continues to rise. This calls for a renewed global resolve anchored in prevention, protection, and partnership. Your Excellency, Mr. President, in Africa, we are witnessing a growing determination to address the structural causes of food insecurity through cooperation, innovation, and shared responsibility. The African Union's Kampala Declaration, under the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Programme, provides a transformative framework for strengthening agri-food system, enhancing productivity, and linking sustainable agriculture to peace and stability. Mr. President, this approach, rooted in African priorities, recognizes that food security is not only about feeding people, but about empowering communities, building inclusive economies, and fostering resilience. Similarly, the African Common Position on Humanitarian Effectiveness demonstrates the value of regional solidarity and local ownership in addressing the root causes of vulnerability. These frameworks remind us that investing in resilience is investment in peace. They also affirm that sustainable food system can serve as a bridge between development, peace building, and helping societies transition from dependency to self-reliance. When communities are empowered, institutions are strengthened, and international support aligns with local priorities, progress is possible. This means listening to women's concern and needs, building upon their resilience, knowledge, and critical role as both producers and caretakers. Mr. President, to move from recognition to action, my delegation would like to highlight several priorities. First, strengthening early warning and accountability mechanism as outlined in Resolution 2417. The Council should ensure that emerging risks are met with timely, coordinated response, and that those who weaponize hunger face appropriate consequence under international law. Second, deepen partnership that integrate humanitarian development and peace-building efforts. Sustainable food system must be central to conflict prevention and post-conflict recovery strategies, ensuring that communities can withstand future shocks. Third, we must center women at every stage of food security solutions and stronger gender lens in policy. This can be achieved through working consistently with sex disaggregated data and supporting alternative livelihood strategies for women in agriculture and beyond. We must contribute to elevating women's voices, resilience, knowledge, leadership at all levels. Genuine, lasting change requires recognizing women as critical drivers of food system sustainability and resilience. Fourth, mobilize predictable and innovative financing that not only supports nationally owned, but also prioritize the transfer of practical knowledge, especially for improving natural resource management and tackling barriers created by unfair trade practices. Investment in rural infrastructure, market access, and local production capacity can yield lasting dividends in peace. To conclude, Mr. President, addressing conflict-related food insecurity is not only a necessity, but a strategic investment in peace and stability. Food must never be used as a weapon, nor should hunger be allowed to deepen division or perpetuate fragility. We reaffirm our collective commitment to transforming food insecurity from source of instability into catalyst for resilience and sustainable development. Our delegation will continue to strengthen partnership and invest in sustainable development to build a future where every person has the right to food, opportunity, and hope. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Excellency Dr. Julius Maada, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and welcome once again to the Council. Guyana commends Sierra Leone for its efficient stewardship of the Security Council this month, and your decision to convene an open debate on a subject of critical importance to global peace and security, conflict-related food insecurity. Thank you, Mr. President, for sharing Sierra Leone's experience, from which there is much we can learn. We thank Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed for her sobering statement and ASG Joyce Masuya for the comprehensive briefing. We also express our appreciation to the AU Special Envoy, Dr. Ibrahim Hassan Mayaki, and FAO's Chief Economist, Mr. Maximo Torero Collin, for their valuable insights. Mr. President, armed conflict and violence remain the primary drivers of acute food insecurity in 14 hotspots of highest concern, according to the FAO WFP Hunger Hotspot report released last Monday. We have just heard from Mr. Torero that nearly 140 million people were affected by conflict-induced hunger in 2024, almost double the number in 2018. We are seeing record levels of hunger around the globe, with famine confirmed in Gaza and Sudan, and the risk of famine in South Sudan. Together with Mali and Haiti, these countries are the 5 highest hunger hotspots of concern. These are the worst situations, not the totality, all man-made and all in protracted conflict contexts. The undeniable reality is that armed conflict and violence drive acute food insecurity in multiple reinforcing ways. Conflict disrupts food production and supply chains, often destroying agriculture infrastructure and displacing communities from their land. These disruptions not only reduce the availability of food, but also significantly limit access for the most vulnerable populations, compounding existing hardship and perpetuating cycles of hunger. We see this in the breakdown of social services, in the destruction of civilian infrastructure, the collapse of food systems, starvation, and displacement, creating a cycle of need across generations, and worse, when exacerbated by climate change and economic shocks. Mr. President, as an elected member of the Council, Guyana has prioritized food insecurity in conflict settings. Building on the efforts of those before us on the Council, we held a debate on the nexus between climate change, food insecurity, and conflict during our presidency last year, and produced a report with Adelphi on the topic, which was launched at the Berlin Climate Conference. In our capacity as co-focal points on conflict and hunger in the Security Council, Guyana worked with Switzerland last year and Slovenia this year to raise awareness, propose Council action, and emphasize the need to implement international humanitarian law to prevent conflict-induced starvation and implement Resolution 2417. We also continue this advocacy as part of the Group of Friends on Action Against Conflict and Hunger. As a result of our work, we have identified several distinct areas where significant gaps persist between early warning mechanisms and decisive action to address conflict-related food insecurity. I will underscore 3 points that are critical to closing these gaps and strengthening our collective response. First, the importance of advocacy, political cooperation, and coordinated action. Advocacy is required to maintain global priority and collective political will for the full implementation of Resolution 2417, which condemns starvation as a method of warfare, and Resolution 2573, condemning the destruction of civilian infrastructure critical to survival. Global cooperation is also required to address funding gaps, the humanitarian shortfall, scale up predictable and flexible funding for humanitarian aid, and enforce compliance with international humanitarian law. In this context, we reaffirm our support for the integrated food security phase classification system. Second, early warning and prevention are pivotal. The role of the Security Council in the maintenance of international peace and security must begin with prevention through the range of diplomatic and political tools available to it. However, this should not limit the Security Council from employing innovative measures and new mechanisms to address conflict-induced hunger. Prevention should also encompass addressing the root causes of an armed conflict, including structural challenges. It must also be informed by comprehensive analyses and innovative approaches to bridging humanitarian and development finance, and by rethinking emergency response. Third and final, individual efforts from each member state can be the catalyst for positive change. Supporting local efforts, community-led initiatives, and context-specific responses is a starting point. Improving national reliance efforts, investing in climate-smart agriculture, agri-food system transformation, and involving women and youth, as we have heard before, have multiplier effects with high impact outcomes. Member states must also work to implement and operationalize Security Council measures, which are critical to ensuring the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and in support of accountability mechanisms. Mr. President, Guyana remains committed to playing its part to address conflict-induced hunger and achieve food security. We have spent the last 2 years collaborating with fellow Council members to ensure that conflict-induced hunger remains a priority for the Security Council and the wider United Nations community. At home, our efforts to achieve food security for our citizens and CARICOM as a whole continue apace. We recognize that without food security, sustainable development will remain out of reach and peace can be threatened. We will continue our efforts and stand ready to share our knowledge and experience with the international community. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to Denmark, the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank the Deputy Secretary General and our briefers for their powerful interventions this morning. President Bio, thank you for your presence today and for your efforts in highlighting the deadly impact of conflict-induced hunger around the world. The briefings we've heard this morning are stark and irrefutable. Conflict continues to drive, exacerbate, and prolong hunger around the world. We see starvation used as a method of war. This is a violation of international humanitarian law, and it undermines the very foundation of our collective responsibility to protect civilians trapped in armed conflict. The international community is failing to realize the promise of zero hunger, and the Security Council is failing to realize the promise of Resolution 2417. Mr. President, allow me to make 3 points. First, the world this year has faced no less than 2 man-made and wholly preventable famines, as the representative from FAO has just described. In Sudan, both the RSF and the SAF have instrumentalized food aid as a tool of war, blocking deliveries, denying access, and manipulating assistance. 21 million people are facing acute food insecurity, all for the sake of political and military gain. In Gaza, severe restrictions on humanitarian aid have placed the entire population of Gaza at risk of a full-scale famine. It is therefore imperative that the UN and other humanitarian organizations are fully enabled to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid in accordance with the humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law. Second, Mr. President, the purposeful destruction of agricultural land and infrastructure essential for survival continues also to be deployed as a weapon. From the mining of fertile fields in Ukraine to the contamination of water sources and the targeting of irrigation systems in South Sudan, these acts inflict enduring harm long after the fighting ends. The loss of livestock, seed banks, and arable land deepens displacement and poverty and exacerbates climate vulnerability, reducing communities' ability to adapt to environmental shocks. Put simply, these deliberate acts are taking lives today and destroying futures for generations to come. Third, Mr. President, we know that hunger will not end with food aid alone. It demands political solutions to end violence, economic measures that sustain livelihoods, and environmental actions that protect the natural systems people depend upon. Within this Council, we must move from reacting to crises to preventing them by linking early warning to early action. And while we are not and should not become a humanitarian council, we bear a special responsibility to act when humanitarian access is willfully denied. In closing, Mr. President, around this table, we know that we have the tools to act. Resolution 2417 was a testament to the Council's resolve to end the scourge of conflict-induced hunger. But more than that, it was a collective call to action, a demand to uphold international humanitarian law, and a demand for accountability for those who violate it. We must now reaffirm our commitment to its full implementation. Denmark stands ready to work with all Council members to break this deadly cycle, to ensure that starvation, denial of aid, and the destruction of food systems are not met with silence, but with action. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you, President. We would like to welcome His Excellency Dr. Julius Maada, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. We're grateful to him for his very wise statement, and we completely endorse the content of that statement. We'd also like to thank the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, for her important intervention, as well as the Assistant Secretary General Joyce Masunya and the Special Envoy of the African Union, Dr. Ibrahim Asana Mayaki, as well as Mr. Maximo Torero, Head Economist of the FAO, for their valuable presentations. Recent figures indicate that over 280 million people confronted acute levels of food insecurity in 2024, with armed conflict the main factor in almost half of these cases. For the first time in over 2 decades, famine was declared simultaneously in 2 territories, Sudan and Gaza. This not only reflects the gravity of the situation, but also the inadequacy of the global response. Likewise, critical situations persist in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where a combination of hostilities, forced displacement, and restrictions on access of humanitarian assistance have deepened the vulnerability of millions of people. Panama is following very closely the situation in Haiti. where the Artibonite region is confronting a very cruel reality. That region has been traditionally the breadbasket of the country. In that area, armed gangs have expanded their control over extensive rural areas, extorting the peasants, burning houses and fields, obstructing irrigation systems. And they have forced the abandonment of thousands of hectares of crops. It is essential for the parties to conflict ensure secure and unrestricted access of humanitarian assistance. And those states, particularly those involved in military operations, comply with their international obligations. The use of restrictions on food and water as a tactic of war, which is tragically reported in too many conflicts, is an unacceptable violation of the most basic norms of humanity. Of course, the special attention must be directed to the millions of children in regions such as South Sudan, Yemen, who are on the verge of famine, while others in Somalia, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Mali, and Myanmar are suffering the consequences of prolonged hunger. In this context, it is encouraging to observe the efforts to ensure the resiliency and sustainability of food systems that have tangible impacts on the lives of communities. Programs such as homegrown school meals of the School Meals Coalition demonstrate that purchasing food from small-scale farmers not only boosts rural economies, but also ensures nutritive food for millions of children, thus strengthening the social fabric. Panama endorses the African Union vision on the value of bolstering African food systems through the Kampala Declaration of the CAADP, which promotes sustainable production and inter-African trade. These integrated initiatives consolidate community cohesion, strengthen resilience in the face of crises, and contribute in a concrete way in preventing the recurrence of conflicts, thus demonstrating the close links between food security, sustainable development, and lasting peace. Mr. President, hunger is not an inevitable phenomenon. It is the result of unresolved conflicts, of climate change, of forced displacement, and too frequently, it is a result of the deliberate denial of food through human activity. Only through constructive dialogue, multilateral cooperation, and early action can we reduce the risks of conflict and move towards a world where food is guaranteed as a human right that it is, rather than a concession or a privilege, so that hunger stops being a threat to international peace and security. And with this in mind, we are happy to see the obvious consensus on many aspects that can be heard in the various statements of the colleagues who have preceded me that are participating in this very important debate. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, distinguished President of Sierra Leone, we're very pleased to see you here today presiding over our meeting. We would like to thank our today's briefers on a topic that leaves no one indifferent. There is consensus that conflicts go hand in hand with hunger. At the same time, the causation here for us is clear. It's not that hunger causes conflict, but rather the conflicts lead to the absence of food security. Hostilities destroy agriculture and trade, they cause mass displacement, and they deprive people of livelihoods. For centuries, humanity has failed to eliminate the nefarious practice of using hunger as a weapon of war, even though today that is a gross violation of IHL. We recall the hopes many countries and UN agencies placed on Security Council Resolution 2417 of 2018. Sadly, we have to acknowledge, though, those hopes were not fulfilled. On the contrary, the statistics from Gaza alone shocks the world on a daily basis. We disagree with singling hunger out as a cause of conflicts. Hunger can only exacerbate already existing crises, just like many other socioeconomic problems. The crises themselves come from political contradictions, religious and ethnic tensions. The most destructive factor is external interference in the sovereign affairs of states, and we have seen examples of that in the tragedies of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Mr. President, we share concern about global hunger statistics throughout the world. The number of people facing acute food insecurity has risen from 112 million in 2018 to 295 million. And chronic undernourishment is something that afflicts 700 million people, and more than 2.3 billion still face inadequate nutrition. At the same time, according to FAO and WFP, wars are not the only cause of hunger. There are natural disasters such as droughts and floods, but also there are economic factors, but their origin is also something that must be properly understood. The UN estimates that enough food is being produced globally. The problem lies in its uneven distribution, where the West's excessive reserves are being accumulated by developing countries, first and foremost in Africa, due to past colonial and current neo-colonial practices, cannot switch the economy to achieve food sovereignty and remain vulnerable to market price fluctuations. And maintaining high prices on these is the concern of major U.S. and European agro-business producers. Their share of global trade in agricultural goods is about 75%. Unfortunately, there is no UN analysis of these global threats to food security. It also took a long time for the truth about how Western states rushed to save their economy during the COVID-19 pandemic emerged without regard for the impact of their reckless financial, economic, and other actions on vulnerable trade partners. The plan was to sweep this under the carpet by conducting a massive propaganda campaign blaming Russia for provoking a global crisis. But gradually the smoke cleared, and we see a very educational story here on the Istanbul Agreement. It showed the commercial nature of the Black Sea Initiative, commercially beneficial to the Western states, which initially was presented as a humanitarian effort to help the country. And more than that, despite the Secretary General's efforts, Western capitals failed to honor their claims that unilateral sanctions would not affect Russian agricultural exports. Unfortunately, it took over 3 years for the UN and its leadership to find the strength to acknowledge the real impact of illegal sanctions based on the UN sources on the ground. For example, the Secretary General's recent report A8415 to the Second Committee of the GA states that unilateral coercive measures worsen socioeconomic conditions in developing countries, that they disrupt humanitarian aid, and they cause food shortages. Of course, these assessments were sorely missing when we discussed illegal sanctions on the breadbasket of the Middle East to Syria or Cuba's long-standing blockade. Additionally, the discussion about illegal sanctions against Russia, one of the world's largest agriculture powers, also is seeing new developments. For example, the flagship reports by FAO, WFP, and IFAD show that the anti-Russian sanctions disrupted global grain supplies, that they drove up fertilizer prices and the shortages of fertilizers, that they increased transport insurance costs, and thus worsened global food security. It is being proven that attempts to blame Russia for rising prices and food shortages are unfounded. By the way, it was not surprising that this report, with a fairly objective assessment, provoked outbursts of hysteria from some Western delegations who demanded an internal investigation. We would like to state here that this kind of pressure on UN bodies is unacceptable. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to say that hunger must be addressed comprehensively. And in this context, what becomes increasingly important is the socio-economic entities of the UN. Humanitarian aid is a temporary measure. The key is strengthening countries' own ability to feed their populations. And this requires international cooperation, solidarity, and the rejection of politicization, unfair competition, and illegal unilateral restrictions. Russian raw materials and food are in demand in 160 countries all over the world. We aim to build reliable, long-term, and equal partnerships and consistently support technological and economic sovereignty as a foundation for political stability. Despite all Western obstacles that are being created, we assist developing countries through various channels, bilaterally and through international organizations, including the UN World Food Programme. Through WFP alone, between 2021 and 2025, Russia provided assistance to Afghanistan, Niger, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Syria, Palestine, Cuba, Yemen, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and other countries to the amount of over 250 million. We helped and will continue to help those in need worldwide. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of China.
Distinguished His Excellency President Bill, I would like to welcome you in presiding over today's meeting in New York, and I thank DSG Amina, ASG Musuya, Mr. Torero, and the Special Envoy Mayakite for their briefings. Food security bears on human survival and is vital to national economies, people's livelihoods, and security. Currently, global food insecurity is aggravating, with 295 million people facing acute hunger, 60% of whom live in conflict-affected areas. The Security Council has always been closely following the issue of conflict and food security and has, through Resolution 2417, set forth a series of clear requirements. The international community should build consensus and form synergy to jointly safeguard global food security and protect people from the threat of hunger. I would like to make 4 points. First, we must uphold political solutions to break the vicious cycle of conflict and hunger. Armed conflict is a major cause of humanitarian crises and hunger. War claims innocent lives, causes widespread displacement, and disrupts agricultural production and economic activities. We call on all parties to the conflict to resolve disputes through dialogue and consultation, bring an early end to hostilities, and restore peace and security. All countries should uphold a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable approach to security, jointly building a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture. The Security Council bears the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security and should actively fulfill its duties to promote political solutions to hotspot issues. Second, upholding international rule of law and safeguarding civilians' basic rights to survival. In conflict zones, humanitarian aid is the primary and often the only lifeline for civilians, with organizations like the UN maintaining the last resort for survival. Regrettably, humanitarian operations are frequently obstructed. The violations of international humanitarian law are constant occurrence. Humanitarian assistance must not be politicized. Hunger must not be weaponized, and humanitarian workers must not become targets of attack. Compliance with international humanitarian law is an obligation for all parties that all parties must fulfill. It is not an option. We call on Israel to strictly comply with international humanitarian law and ensure large-scale entry of humanitarian supplies into Gaza. The humanitarian situation in Sudan is extremely dire. The Rapid Support Forces must immediately lift restrictions on humanitarian access in Al Fashir to ensure safe entry and distribution of supplies. Third, we must promote sustainable development to tackle the root causes of conflicts and food insecurity. Inclusive and sustainable development is a vital foundation for lasting peace and a fundamental guarantee for protecting people from hunger. The international community should increase support for developing countries, enhancing their capacity for development and governance to achieve lasting stability. We must resolutely oppose unilateralism and protectionist measures such as the abuse of tariffs and the erection of fences and barriers, creating a fair and favorable international environment for developing countries to access global markets and share the dividends of emerging industries. For some time now, a certain developed country has been reluctant to fulfill its commitment on development financing, even cutting off funding to international development agencies and openly opposing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which has dealt a severe blow to development efforts of the world. We call on all parties to uphold genuine multilateralism, foster a stable and open international development environment, accelerate efforts to bridge the North-South development divide, and achieve shared development. Fourth, improving global food and agriculture governance to safeguard shared global food security. The international food and agriculture market has long been plagued by issues such as monopolistic pricing power of major grain traders, excessive financialization of agricultural products, structural imbalances in production and supply chains, and inadequate representation of developing countries. Chinese President Xi Jinping's Global Governance Initiative offers a Chinese solution to a more just and equitable global governance system, providing important guidance for improving global food and agriculture governance. The international community should unite and collaborate to enhance the representation, voice, and decision-making power of developing countries. It must eliminate unreasonable restrictions on food production and exports, combat speculative capital and price monopolies, build a production and supply chain with security, stability, mutual benefit, and win-win, and establish a more fair and equitable international food trade order. President, China attaches great importance to food security. We are committed to feeding our population of over 1.4 billion people through our own efforts, while providing assistance within our capabilities to countries in need, thereby contributing China's strength to global food security. China will continue to support the UN in playing a vital role in international food and agriculture, and remains committed to improving global food security through international cooperation, making greater contributions to eradicating hunger and safeguarding food security. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Sierra Leone for convening this timely debate. And we welcome your presence, Mr. President, to chair this meeting. And we appreciate your important and invaluable statement. We also appreciate the briefers, DSG Amina Mohammed, ASG Joyce Masuya, Dr. Ibrahim Hassan Mayaki, and Mr. Torero for their important insights into the hunger conflict nexus and ways to address it. The global environment today demonstrates a dangerous two-way dynamic. Conflicts, including foreign occupation, are driving hunger on a massive scale, while hunger and economic desperation are in turn aggravating fragility and heightening the risk of renewed or protracted conflict. According to the 2025 Global Report on Food Crises, more than 294 million people in 53 countries face acute food insecurity. In 14 of the 16 most severe hotspots, conflict remains the primary driver. Mr. President, it is a matter of great concern that starvation and collective punishment have often been used as tools to advance military or political objectives in stark violation of international humanitarian law and UN Security Council Resolution 2417. Nowhere was this more visible than in Gaza, where the latest assessments indicate that 100% of the population faced high levels of acute food insecurity, with a significant proportion already in the most severe catastrophic phase, marked by starvation, destitution, and death. The ongoing peace process offers a measure of hope, but it will take years to reverse the devastation of the past 2 years. It is therefore imperative that the ceasefire is fully respected and implemented, that humanitarian access remains unhindered, and that urgent efforts begin towards reconstruction and rehabilitation. Patterns of devastation are also evident in Yemen, Sudan, South Sudan, DRC, Haiti, and other protected conflict areas, including occupied territories where livelihoods have collapsed and millions are now dependent on humanitarian assistance for survival. President, we believe that food insecurity in conflict zones must be addressed through a comprehensive and principled approach. First, the universal and consistent application of UN Charter principles, Security Council resolutions, and international law in all conflict situations is imperative. It is the persistence of double standards and political expediency that often enables continued violations. Second, humanitarian assistance must never be subjected to political conditions. All parties must comply with international humanitarian law, fully comply with ceasefires, allow safe and unimpeded aid delivery, and protect humanitarian personnel. Accountability for deliberate obstruction or delays is a must. Third, we must also address the systemic causes of poverty and hunger, eliminate rural poverty, and protect our food systems, which are the main source of livelihoods for nearly 4.5 billion people. We must enlarge food production, moderate food prices, and reform unequal agricultural trade. Climate-induced disasters, including recurrent floods and droughts, continue to erode food security. We must scale up support for adaptation and resilience. It requires not sympathy, but solidarity and genuine partnership, as emphasized by you, Mr. President, with particular reference to Africa. Fourth, the response must be comprehensive. A whole-of-system approach is required to break the cycle, from prevention and early warning systems to conflict resolution to long-term peace building. The scramble for natural resources must end. Political solutions must be prioritized, hence the importance of pacific settlement of disputes reaffirmed by this Council in Resolution 2788 in July. Mr. President, the Security Council has a vital role in ensuring that conflict does not deprive civilians of their fundamental right to food, and to also ensure advance measures that prevent weaponization of hunger, safeguard humanitarian access, and strengthen the resilience of communities affected by conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Your Excellency, President Bio, we thank Sierra Leone for convening this timely debate as the WFP warns for the first time in recent history the world is facing two concurrent famines in Sudan and in Gaza. Hence, the clear-eyed analysis of the briefings we heard this morning come at a critical juncture. The 2025 Global Report on Food Crisis and the FAO WFP Hunger Spots 25-26 Outlook leave no doubt. Conflict remains the principal driver of acute hunger. According to the Hunger Hotspots report, acute food insecurity is likely to worsen across 16 countries and territories. Among them, Sudan, Palestine, South Sudan, Haiti, and Mali remain hotspots of highest concern, while Yemen has now been elevated to the same category. The stark reality is a moral alarm bell that just jolted the international community into unified action. Across this context, armed violence destroys harvests, blocks markets, and displaces millions, severing livelihoods and eroding resilience. The figures are staggering. In Sudan, 24.6 million people are projected to face crisis or worse levels of food insecurity. In Gaza, despite the partial resumption of humanitarian assistance since mid-October, 1/3 of the population is expected to face famine, the highest IPC faced. In South Sudan, 57% of the population faces high levels of acute food insecurity. In Haiti, by June 2026, 5.9 million people, over half the population, is projected to face crisis and will struggle to survive. These are not statistics. They are lives, families, women, and children caught in the crossfire of conflict and deprivation. In this respect, I want to highlight the following. First, conflict multiplies vulnerability. Reports show that armed conflict and violence remain the primary driver of acute food insecurity. In 14 out of 16 hotspots, armed violence is the dominant cause of hunger. Food insecurity today is not inventable. It is mostly man-made. This also means it is almost always foreseeable and preventable. Second, the surge in hunger is occurring amid shrinking humanitarian resources. Only 36% of the required funding for food security has been received by October 2025. At the same time, official development assistance is projected to decline by 13% this year. This erosion of support has devastating effects. Food assistance is rationed, nutrition programs are cut, and pathways from relief to recovery collapse. Predictable financing, particularly through multilateral mechanisms, is an essential to sustain operations and rebuild livelihoods. Third, addressing conflict-related food insecurity requires coherent political, humanitarian, and development action. United Nations Security Council Resolution 2417 reminds us that the deliberate starvation of civilians is prohibited. Yet, such violations persist. The Council must ensure that Resolution 2417 is translated into consistent practice, demanding respect for humanitarian law, unhindered humanitarian access to all civilians, and holding accountable those who weaponize hunger. In the context of accessibility, I would like to underscore the indispensable role of maritime security in safeguarding global food supply chains. Nearly 90% of traded food commodities move by sea. Disruptions to maritime routes due to conflict directly jeopardize the availability and affordability of food worldwide. Fourth, we must recognize that food security is national security. Where people cannot feed their families, despair fuels displacement, instability, and conflict. When food systems collapse, so do economies, institutions, and social cohesion. Investing in food security is therefore an investment in peace. No nation can be secure when its people are hungry. Mr. President, on this occasion, we reaffirm our steadfast commitment to global food security. Greece is party to the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty since 2024 and was among the early signatories of the 2023 joint communiqué condemning the use of food as a weapon of war. Translating commitment into action, Greece proudly participates in the Grain from Ukraine initiative under WFP. Further, in solidarity with civilians, Greece airdropped 8.5 tons of food supplies in Gaza earlier this year, while also being a contributing donor to WFP's operations in Sudan. The human cost of inaction is measured in lives lost, in children irreversibly malnourished, and in communities robbed of hope. The hunger hotspots and global report on food crisis are not records of despair. They are calls to coordinated, decisive action. Preventing famine and ending the weaponization of hunger are not only moral imperatives, they are political responsibilities. Greece stands ready to work with all partners to ensure that conflict no longer consigns millions to hunger. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I welcome your participation, Excellency Dr. Julius Maada, President of the Republic, and commend Sierra Leone for convening this timely open debate. We also thank the Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammed, the Assistant Secretary General, Ms. Joyce Msuya, the African Union Special Envoy, Dr. Ibrahim Hassan Miyaki, and Mr. Maximo Torero Kulen for their thoughtful briefing. Although the Security Council adopted Resolution 2417 in 2018, resolution which identifies the link between armed conflict and hunger, resolution which condemns the use of starvation as a method of warfare. Acute food insecurity continues to escalate. The 2025 Global Report on Food Crisis demonstrates that conflicts remains the primary drivers of the most severe crisis. Nowhere is this starker than in Sudan, than in Gaza. In Gaza and Sudan, siege tactics, restrictions on food, clean water, fuel and electricity, and repeated strikes on essential infrastructures have amounted to the use of starvation as a weapon of war. The impact on civilians, especially children, has been profound, with long-term consequences that cannot be reversed. The link between hunger and conflict feeds a vicious circle, a vicious cycle. Breaking this cycle is essential if the Council is to uphold its responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, allow me to highlight 3 priority areas. First, starvation. Starvation can never be justified as a tool of war. Parties to conflict must protect civilians and the system crucial to their survival, including food production and water infrastructure, and must allow unimpeded humanitarian access to the needy population. Algeria is actively engaged in this agenda, co-chairing the working group on the protection of civilian infrastructure within the global initiative to galvanize political commitment to the international humanitarian law. Our commitment to humanitarian personnel was reaffirmed when we signed 2 months ago the Declaration on their protection in September 2025. Second, sustainable political solutions are indispensable. Many countries confront overlapping pressures from economic shocks, climate extremes, inflation, displacement. Algeria supports socio-economic development as a foundation for stability through its cooperation agency, which finances projects across Africa in partnership with UNICEF and UNDP. Third, President, the Council should advance concrete measures, including creating early warning mechanism for violations against food, energy, and water systems, mobilizing financial resources to rapidly restore essential services in conflict setting, guaranteeing safe, rapid, and unhindering humanitarian access, ensuring accountability for attacks on civilian infrastructure, and finally, establishing a dedicated sanction regime targeting parties that violate Resolution 2417 and commit international humanitarian law breaches such as starvation as a weapon of warfare. Mr. President, food insecurity can arise from many factors, but when it is driven or exacerbated by armed conflict, the international community, the Security Council, has a duty to respond swiftly and decisively. Algeria remains fully committed to working with all partners to protect civilians, to uphold international humanitarian law, and to promote just and lasting peace in the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Korea commends Sierra Leone for convening this timely debate on the presence of His Excellency Dr. Julius Maada, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. I also thank the Deputy Secretary General Mohammed, ASG Musia, Special Envoy Mayaki, and Mr. Torero for their insights. Mr. President, the relationship between conflict and food insecurity is interconnected and mutually reinforcing. Helping communities in need requires integrated and holistic approaches that address both immediate requirements and structural causes. In this regard, the Republic of Korea underscores the following three priorities where the international community must take more decisive action. First, ensuring unimpeded humanitarian access and responding to urgent needs. Time and again, we have seen a disturbing pattern of the deliberate obstruction of aid. Notably, humanitarian access has been used as a weapon of war, aid convoys denied, warehouses looted, and relief workers targeted, leaving millions trapped in certain areas declared by the UN as in famine. Recalling Resolution 2417, my delegation urges all parties to conflict to respect their obligation under international humanitarian law, facilitate rapid and unhindered humanitarian access at scale. At the same time, the Council and the international community must support more active, responsive approaches, including cash-based transfer and flexible funding to reach those most in need. We can't allow crises like Yemen become the law, where funding shortfalls have left more than 70 million people facing acute hunger. In particular, the Republic of Korea is implementing REACH initiative, responding with emergency assistance for conflict-affected households in partnership with World Food Program in countries such as Myanmar, Syria, Palestine, and Sudan to alleviate humanitarian crisis. This partnership is also expected to contribute to enhancing food security in those countries by providing emergency food and nutrition support. Second, enhancing coordination between the Security Council and other UN mechanisms in addressing food insecurity. In this Sahel region, we witnessed how compounding effects of conflict, climate shocks, and displacement create catastrophic conditions where extremism and terrorism can thrive. Tackling these interconnected challenges demands integrated strategies that bridge the humanitarian, development, peace nexus. In this context, the Peacebuilding Commission is uniquely positioned to play a catalytic role by convening a broad range of stakeholders. We propose that the PBC organize thematic sessions focused on specific countries or regions facing conflict-related food insecurity, such as Sahel, assembling relevant UN entities, regional organizations, and international financial institutions. Lastly, but not least, strengthening food system resilience. Resilient agri-food system can withstand shocks, reduce communities' vulnerability to manipulation, and prevent local disruptions from cascading into broader instability. This is why building sustainable food system must remain a core concern of this Council and the wider UN membership. In this vein, my delegation welcomes the 2025 Kampala CAADP Declaration, an ambitious roadmap for transforming Africa's agri-food system. In the same guiding spirit, the Republic of Korea proudly supports African countries in localizing and improving rice production by sharing high-yield rice varieties and agricultural technology. Mr. President, in closing, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its unwavering commitment to combating the scourge of food insecurity in communities where they matter most. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I welcome Your Excellency, President Bio, to the Council, and I thank Sierra Leone for convening this important debate. I also thank DSG Mohammed, ASG Masuya, Dr. Mayaki, and Mr. Terrero for their frank and sobering briefings. Colleagues, famine in the 21st century is not a natural disaster. It is a man-made tragedy. The evidence is clear. Nearly 300 million people face acute food insecurity, most in countries affected by conflict. Across Sudan, Gaza, the Sahel, Yemen, and Myanmar, conflict has devastated harvests, shattered supply chains, and uprooted families from the land they depend on. I'll make 3 points. First, the Security Council has a responsibility to address conflict, to prevent escalation, and to support efforts towards inclusive and sustainable peace. We have the tools. Resolutions 2417 and 2573 are unequivocal. Starvation as a weapon of war and attacks on civilian infrastructure are unacceptable. We urge all member states to strengthen monitoring, reporting, and accountability for violations, and to uphold their obligations under these resolutions. Second, international humanitarian law must be upheld. The United Kingdom calls on all parties to conflict to comply fully with international humanitarian law and allow rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access. When aid is blocked or delayed, it is the most vulnerable who suffer first. Families are cut off from food, and children face acute malnutrition. In April, the UK launched the Conflict, Hunger and International Humanitarian Law Handbook, offering practical guidance to minimise food insecurity during conflict. Third, we must act to prevent hunger wherever it occurs. Conflict breeds hunger, but hunger can also fuel instability and further conflict. The UK's Resilience and Adaptation Fund, alongside our humanitarian financing, is supporting longer-term solutions in fragile and conflict-affected states. Building local systems that protect people, markets, and livelihoods in the face of climatic and other shocks. We are investing in climate-resilient agriculture, supporting local food systems, and championing the participation of women and youth in building resilient communities. The UK remains committed to supporting food security and tackling conflict-driven hunger. We are the largest bilateral donor to the Food and Agriculture Organization, and this year alone contributed over $540 million to the World Food Programme for critical interventions, including in Palestine and Sudan. President, the UK will continue to press for sustained humanitarian access and invest in resilience so that conflict does not condemn communities to hunger. We all must use the tools at our disposal to break this cycle. I thank you.
Thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we would like to thank Sierra Leone for organizing this open debate today. And we thank you, President Maada Bio, for chairing the meeting and thus for elevating the importance of conflict-induced hunger for global peace and security. We thank all briefers for their insight. Colleagues, serving as the informal co-focal point on conflict and hunger with Guyana, we feel we encountered acute food insecurity too many times during our tenure. For the first time ever, we faced two famines unfolding simultaneously in Gaza and in Sudan. And these are not the only crises demanding our urgent response. Attention to the looming hunger is critically needed in Yemen, South Sudan, Eastern DRC, Mali, Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, and beyond. The interplay of climate and conflict continues unleashing the perfect storm on the already vulnerable populations. My first message today is on the need to globally enhance the respect of international humanitarian and human rights law, the clearest tool we have to prevent conflict-driven hunger. Armed conflict does not inevitably produce famine. Disrespect for international humanitarian law and this Council's resolution does. Through siege tactics, destruction of agricultural system, obstruction of aid, or attacks on markets, water systems, and transport routes, the result is predictable: starvation, disease, displacement, and the collapse of people's ability to feed themselves. When starvation as a weapon of war continues with impunity in one conflict, erosion of respect for international humanitarian law is inevitable in all the others. As a consequence, we are confronted with the largest number of starving civilians in conflicts. My second message is on the role of this Council and the tools at its disposal. Over the past year, through numerous informal briefings convened by Slovenia and Guyana with partners, one lesson has stood out clearly: knowledge shapes this Council's action. And through multiple extraordinary Council meetings requested by our delegations, we have seen that action. Even the smallest of steps saves lives. A newly opened crossing point, a temporary ceasefire that enables delivery, a humanitarian corridor negotiated in time. This Council should systematically benefit from regular reporting and early warning data. The United Nations and its partners, especially the Global Network Against Food Crisis, must continue to use this chamber to sound the alarm. The IPC reports must remain a trusted and protected source for this Council. To quote a compelling argument from our partners at the Global Coalition for Action Against Hunger in Conflict, and I quote, "If we can document it, we can predict it. If we can predict it, we can prevent it." End of quote. My final message their babies carry trauma for life. Girls or boys caught in crossfire bear scars for life. Those already at heightened risk, children, women, persons with disabilities, older persons, displaced, those facing movement restrictions, those under occupation, are disproportionately affected. This is why prevention matters. This is why compliance with international law matters. And this is why accountability matters. And this is why the action of this Council matters. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President of Sierra Leone, I should say. Welcome to New York. I'd like to thank you and congratulate Sierra Leone on your presidency of the Council, as well as for your personal efforts as the chair of the ECOWAS and the Service of Establishing Peace, in particular in West Africa. I would like to thank Sierra Leone for this debate on an essential topic for international peace and security. The speakers we heard, Madam Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, Madam Masuya, Deputy Coordinator for Emergency Relief, Mr. Mayaki, Special Envoy of the African Union for Food Systems, and Mr. Kulin, Head Economist of the FAO, have illustrated the multiple dimensions of this topic. We heard, as we heard, the number of people suffering from hunger is increasing. Famine was confirmed in Sudan, and millions of people are suffering from hunger and malnutrition in the Democratic Republic of the Congo or in Haiti. Children and women are particularly affected with devastating consequences. This was underscored both in the short and long term. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it deliberately provoked a blockade with dramatic consequences for global food security. Considerable efforts were required to reduce the devastating effects of that blockade, in particular for developing countries and for the most vulnerable populations. Yes, it's true. conflicts and violence are today the main cause of food insecurity. Mr. President, as the organ in charge of international food and security, as international security, this council must act. Must anticipate and act in advance. Anticipating means acting fully on the warnings transmitted by the Secretary General pursuant to Resolution 2417, or warnings that come from the Harmonized Framework IPC, and France salutes its work, or those from the Global Network Against Food Crises. Next, we must be fully mobilized to ensure the full implementation of the resolutions of this council. Humanitarian access, secure and unobstructed, must be ensured in all circumstances. The use of famine as a war is banned. Indispensable infrastructure for the survival of population, including for agriculture and food production, must be protected. Perpetrators of violation must be held accountable. Impunity is unacceptable. In Sudan, where war rages, in Gaza, where we hope the ceasefire lasts, famine has spread while dozens of tons of aid were ready to be delivered. France reiterates its strongest condemnation of the atrocities committed by the rapid support forces during and after the taking of El Fasher in Yemen. The detention by the Houthis of dozens of humanitarian workers in violation of international law has further aggravated alarming levels of food insecurity. France reiterates its strongest condemnation and its call for the immediate release of the detained personnel. Lastly, we must have a long-term vision. This council must act not only to achieve ceasefires, but also to establish a lasting peace. It must open the path after conflicts to projects, resilience projects focused on strengthening agricultural food production systems. That is what was done for Syria. Gaza has just experienced a devastating war that subjected its population to famine. Thanks to the efforts of the United States, Qatar, Egypt, and the adoption of the Trump Plan, the Declaration of New York, a glimmer of hope has appeared. France will take full part in the reconstruction of Gaza, which necessarily will require not only humanitarian assistance, but the rehabilitation of arable lands and agricultural infrastructure. Mr. President, 2025 will have been the year of sad records, with the confirmation of 2 simultaneous famines and the largest number of conflicts ever recorded. The Summit Nutrition for Growth, organized in Paris last March, made it possible to mobilize some $30 billion in favor of eradicating malnutrition of all its forms at the global level. Let's make sure that our council does its part in the service of this noble goal. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. At this juncture, I wish to remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. The flashing lights on the microphone will prompt speakers to bring their statements to a close after 3 minutes. I now give the floor to Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Kazakhstan warmly welcomes you, Your Excellency, to New York, and commends Sierra Leone for convening this timely debate. We thank today's briefers for their valuable insights. The link between conflict and food insecurity has become one of the most alarming global trends of our time. Hunger is no longer solely a humanitarian challenge. It has become a major driver of instability, displacement, and repeated cycles of violence. As underlined in Resolution 2417, the deliberate destruction of food systems or the starvation of civilians constitutes a grave violation of international humanitarian law and must be addressed with unity and determination. Climate change further exacerbates these challenges. In many regions, rising temperatures, droughts, and land degradation are eroding livelihoods, fueling migration, and heightening competition over scarce natural resources. Kazakhstan firmly believes that sustainable peace is impossible without resilient food systems. We are proud to host in Astana the Islamic Organization for Food Security, a specialized institution of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that brings together 42 member states. The Organization of Food Security plays a key role in developing strategic food reserves, providing humanitarian assistance, and building agricultural capacity across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Its recent initiatives on grain security, early warning systems, and support to conflict-affected populations, including in Gaza, demonstrate how regional mechanisms can effectively complement the UN system. We encourage stronger cooperation between the Islamic Organization of Food Security, FAO, WFP, IFART, and other UN entities to enhance global resilience and ensure that no community becomes vulnerable to hunger as a consequence of conflict. Mr. President, preventing food insecurity requires more than emergency response. It demands long-term investment in climate-smart agriculture, water-efficient technologies, early warning systems, and inclusive rural development. As a major agricultural producer and reliable food supplier, Kazakhstan stands ready to expand cooperation with all partners. We remain committed to supporting global and regional efforts, promoting equitable trade, and contributing to global humanitarian assistance. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Philippines congratulates Sierra Leone for convening this important debate on conflict-related food insecurity. We also thank the briefers for their valuable contributions. Mr. President, the majority of the world's food insecure live in countries ravaged by armed conflict, which disrupts food production and distribution, displaces communities, destroys critical infrastructure, and blocks humanitarian access. Conversely, food insecurity heightens tensions, deepens marginalization, and can fuel further violence. Breaking this vicious cycle requires our collective resolve and coordinated action. The Philippines emphasizes the following 3 points. First, civilians and food systems must be protected. Security Council Resolutions 2417 and 2573 stresses that the use of starvation as a method of warfare is prohibited under international humanitarian law, and parties to conflict must protect civilian infrastructure essential for survival. Second, humanitarian access should be prioritized. We call on all parties to armed conflict to uphold their obligations under international law and facilitate rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian assistance. Women, children, and vulnerable populations bear the disproportionate burden of conflict-induced hunger and must be prioritized. Third, building resilient and sustainable food systems is essential for lasting peace. Rural and agricultural development, market access, livelihood diversification, and equitable resource distribution are vehicles to stability and sustainable development that address root causes of conflict. The Philippines' peace process in Mindanao demonstrates that addressing land rights, providing livelihood opportunities, and agricultural development are key components for sustainable peace agreements. Through the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in the south of the country, we work to ensure that formerly conflict-affected communities have access to agricultural support, markets, and food security programs that promote economic opportunity and activity. Nationally, the Philippines advances food security through our Rice Competitiveness Enhancement Program, climate-resilient agriculture initiatives, and social protection programs that seek to cushion vulnerable populations from food price shocks. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Philippines stands ready to work with all member states and the broader international community to help break the harmful cycle of conflict and food insecurity. We support the Security Council's continued consideration and action on this important topic. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Philippines for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Sierra Leone for convening this meeting
and I thank the briefers for their valuable insights. It is Indonesia's constitutional mandate to contribute to building a world order based on freedom, peace, and social justice. This means a world free of fear, of conflict, and hunger. This is why Indonesia places high importance on food security as a key pillar for peace, stability, and prosperity. And while Indonesia has been fortunate to be blessed with enough resources to continue pursuing food security, in other parts of the world, many countries still face great challenges. Nearly 300 million people are facing acute food insecurity in conflict-affected countries and territories in 2024. This is unacceptable. We need a strong United Nations with a robust Security Council with the protection of civilians at the heart of our efforts. Against this backdrop, we wish to emphasize 3 points. First, we must reject the use of starvation as a weapon of war. We regret that there are actors involved in conflict situations who keep ignoring international humanitarian law, hence deepening the food crisis. The Security Council needs to use all available tools, including appropriate monitoring mechanisms, to strengthen prevention and accountability. Second, we must ensure sustained humanitarian assistance. The most essential step is cessation of hostilities and maintaining safe, unhindered, and unimpeded humanitarian access. Equally important is to protect all humanitarian personnel working on the ground to save lives. This also entails ensuring the protection of logistics and infrastructures that are critical to food security. We call for the international community to step up humanitarian actions to avert the widespread of hunger in conflict situations. On our part this year, Indonesia has contributed $12 million through the World Food Programme to address the severe food crisis in Gaza and dispatched more than 120 tons of humanitarian aid to Myanmar. Third, we must break the vicious cycle of conflict and food insecurity. Addressing the root causes of conflict and finding a lasting solution for peace requires a holistic approach. This requires synergy between all relevant UN bodies and agencies. Furthermore, strengthening collaboration with regional and sub-regional organizations is crucial. Indonesia welcomes regional initiatives such as those set out by the African Union and stands ready to contribute. Mr. President, the topic of our debate today clearly shows that the challenges of peace and security are multifaceted. Indonesia, therefore, believes that it is more important than ever
to strengthen the multilateral system to address these challenges. Rest assured of Indonesia's support towards these efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Indonesia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Mr. President, we welcome the presence of His Excellency Mr. Julius Maada, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, at the opening of this meeting. We're grateful for the presentation of the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed. We express solidarity with the brethren nations of Africa, where long-standing conflicts persist, a legacy of centuries of domination and colonial exploitation that affected the development of their peoples. Many of these peoples today are suffering the consequence of this, including food insecurity. Mr. President, the report of this year on the state of food insecurity and nutrition in the world, elaborated by various UN agencies and programs, estimates that between 638 and 720 million people are suffered hunger in 2024. That is somewhere between 7.8 and 8.8% of the world's population. Prospects towards 2030 are not encouraging. Only 5 years before the deadline established for the fulfillment of the 2030 agenda, the goal of eradicating hunger remains distant and represents one of humanity's major pending duties. The General Assembly is called upon to lead global efforts to fulfill this goal, together with other specialized agencies of the UN system. At the same time, global reports assure that conflicts continue to be the main catalyst of acute food insecurity, affecting some 140 million people in 20 countries and territories. This past August, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the UNICEF, and the World Food Program, and the WHO were reported that over 500,000 people in Gaza were caught up in famine. In spite of the negotiated ceasefire, there are still obstacles to access by Palestinians to humanitarian aid, including to food. WFP has informed that this month of November that the quantity of food in Gaza continues to be severely limited and inadequate. This is to be added to the fact that 98.5% of agricultural lands of the Gaza Strip are damaged, inaccessible, or both at the same time, which imposes significant challenges to the grave food situation. This data illustrates that hunger is being used as a powerful weapon of war against the Palestinian population. While we deliberate, millions of people in Gaza are condemned to hunger as a consequence of the actions of genocide, extermination, and ethnic cleansing carried out by Israel with impunity and with military and financial supplies ensured by the government of the United States. The Security Council must put an end to these actions in compliance of its mandate to preserve international peace and security. Mr. President, the resources are abundant on the planet, but they're squandered by the major powers for their own interests, including to develop sophisticated devices to kill. What's important is to redistribute the riches in a just way. It's urgent to respond to the long-standing appeal of developing countries to establish an international order that is just, democratic, and equitable, that makes it possible to deal with the root causes of hunger and inequalities and promote sustainable development for all peoples, thus eliminating potential triggers of conflicts that affect international peace and security. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba for the statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Eda Sampson, Deputy Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Andorra and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, we're off track for achieving SDG 2, zero hunger, by 2030. Acute hunger has tripled in the last decade. We see rising global needs, whilst international priorities are shifting and resources diminishing. There are many causes for acute food insecurity, but three stand out: conflict and insecurity, climate change, and economic shocks and fragility. Mr. President, for the first time since the IPC was established in 2004, two famines are unfolding simultaneously in Sudan and Gaza, while South Sudan, Haiti, Yemen, and Mali remain at risk of famine. These food and malnutrition crises are entirely man-made and preventable. Yet, humanitarian access is denied, aid workers are attacked, and civilians and food-related infrastructures are being targeted. In line with Security Council Resolution 2417, we strongly condemn the use of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, as prohibited by international humanitarian law. As we have heard today, across Gaza, Sudan, South Sudan, Yemen, the DRC, Haiti, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and the Sahel, and other regions, a combination of conflict and/or climate shocks with economic instability are disrupting food systems and driving food insecurity to unprecedented levels. Humanitarian access should be ensured, and respect for the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence strengthened. Regional organizations, such as the African Union and others, play a vital role in preventing and responding to these crises. and the European Union remains committed to working in close partnership with them. Mr. President, the right to adequate and nutritious food is a human right. Fighting hunger and malnutrition lies at the heart of our humanitarian work, and we will stand firm in our engagement. The EU is a member of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, and we intend to uphold relevant commitments. We are deeply concerned by the persistent violations of international humanitarian law, the shrinking of humanitarian space, and the record number of attacks against humanitarian and UN personnel in 2023 and 2024, the highest numbers in recent decades. In line with our efforts to promote respect for international humanitarian law, monitoring and reporting violations, the EU supports a pilot project with Action Against Hunger to track violations of Resolution 2417. We also contribute, through the Global Network Against Food Crisis, to regular reporting to the Security Council on conflict-driven hunger. As global funding for food crisis declines, the European Union has been and will remain a stable and reliable donor. Team Europe response to global food insecurity in our partner countries since 2022 has amounted to €18 billion. As to some recent debates about the impact of international measures like sanctions on global food security, let me be crystal clear. All EU actions taken in response to grave violations of international law are not only lawful, proportionate, and fully justified in protecting the principles of the UN Charter, but also in every instance carefully designed to ensure that civilians are protected, that food reaches those who need it most, and that collateral consequences for global food security, trade, or access to essential goods are avoided. On the contrary, the impact of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and its deliberate targeting of agricultural infrastructure and the obstruction of maritime routes have severely disrupted exports, driven up food and fertilizer prices, and put additional pressure on vulnerable populations worldwide. Any restrictive measures adopted by countries in response to Russia's violation of the UN Charter were thus not the cause of agricultural disruption. Mr. President, urgent action is needed. First, unimpeded, sustained, rapid, and safe access. Through humanitarian diplomacy, we must push to protect civilians, infrastructure, and aid workers. Second, we need to condemn unreservedly the persistent disrespect for international humanitarian law, the shrinking of humanitarian space, and the record number of attacks against humanitarian and UN personnel, especially local and national. The EU is committed to strengthening humanitarian diplomacy efforts to ensure respect for international humanitarian law, facilitate access, and promote accountability for violations. Third, the international community needs to support humanitarian actors deliver assistance more effectively and efficiently, while ensuring the safety and security of those providing it. We must strengthen the humanitarian development peace nexus, ensuring that life-saving assistance goes hand in hand with structural interventions that address the root causes. Mr. President, as a principal donors and partners, the EU and its member states remain invested in actively supporting an inclusive, sustainable, and truly transformative humanitarian reset. In these difficult times, we must stand in solidarity, united and determined. A hunger crisis of this magnitude and complexity demands collective, immediate, and coherent action. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Sampson for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, Italy fully aligns itself with the statement just delivered by the European Union and wishes to add some further remarks in its national capacity. We thank Sierra Leone for foregrounding during its Security Council's presidency the issue of conflict-related food insecurity, a top priority for Italy. Food insecurity is both a humanitarian and development issue. We need to implement immediate actions to address the humanitarian side of food crisis, while working on short, medium and long-term development strategies to improve food systems globally. Italy recognized the great importance of tackling the nexus between conflict and food insecurity. which has therefore been identified as a strategic priority of our foreign policy and for global peace. This is why we firmly support Security Council Resolution 2417, and we stand ready to work within the Security Council to transform the commitments the REIN laid out into robust monitoring, reporting, and accountability mechanisms. Italy remains deeply committed to addressing conflict-related food security in Africa. In this spirit, we are proud to support, among others, the populations of Eastern Sudan through a new contribution of €6.5 million in partnership with the World Food Programme. This initiative targets the most vulnerable, including children and pregnant or nursing women, providing essential nutrition and humanitarian assistance in the Gadaref and Kassala states. Moreover, Italy's Food for Gas initiative is a tangible expression of our commitment to safeguarding civilians and sustaining food systems in conflict-affected areas. Through close coordination with the World Food Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement, we have delivered over 2,000 tons of food, medical, and relief supplies to the Gaza Strip. We also continue to support Ukraine in mitigating the humanitarian impact of conflict on food security, considering that the Russian aggression has hindered food security well beyond Ukraine's borders. In this context, we support the Grain from Ukraine initiative, which assists Ukraine in its grain production and export capacity. Recently, Italy also has signed an agreement to allocate €9 million to strengthen sustainable agricultural development in the Odessa region. Moreover, we must remember that conflict and displacement continue to disrupt food systems from production, manufacturing, and marketing to consumption and the management of food loss and waste. This is why we need an integrated approach that factors in fragility, post-crisis context, vulnerability, and food insecurity as a multidimensional phenomenon, not just technical agriculture. The Rome-based agencies, FAO, IFAD, and WFP, stand at the heart of global efforts to make food systems more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive. From early warning and anticipatory action to smallholder financing and climate-smart agriculture, they are uniquely positioned to connect humanitarian response with long-term development. Italy is proud to host and support the Rome-based agencies as global hubs for food security and nutrition. More recently, Italy co-hosted, together with Ethiopia, the UN Food Systems Summit +4 stocktake. Following the previous editions of the summit held in New York and Rome, we strongly believed in the importance of holding this second stocktake moment in Africa, which is one of the continents most affected by conflicts. Today, let us reiterate our collective commitment to confront food insecurity with urgency, determination, innovation, and solidarity. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Italy for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Thank you, Chairman, President. We're grateful to Sierra Leone for convening this debate and for the comprehensive approach that proposes regarding the relation between hunger and conflict. We're also grateful to Madam Amina Mohammed, Madam Joyce Masuya, Mr. Maximo Torero, Mr. Ibrahim Hassane. For Chile, hunger cannot be a weapon of war. Its use, deliberate use against civilians with exacerbated impact against women and children is a grave violation of international humanitarian law, human rights, international criminal law, contrary to the fundamental principles of this organization. The Council must ensure the full implementation of Resolution 2417, demand accountability, and strengthen mechanisms of monitoring and early warning that prevent famine in contexts of conflict. No political difference can justify the use of hunger as an instrument of coercion. The reality on the ground is clear in situations such as Palestine, Ukraine, Sudan, Haiti, DRC. Conflicts continue to deliberately disrupt food production systems, destroying livelihoods and forcing the displacement of entire communities, affecting women, children, and older adults. In the face of these challenges, we must promote strict respect for international law, protecting critical infrastructure, ensuring unhindered humanitarian access, promoting cooperation between UN agencies, local governments, regional organizations, and civil society. With this in mind, Chile values the initiatives of the African Union and its strategies to link agricultural production with community resilience and peace building. At the same time, it's essential to acknowledged that food insecurity can become a factor that aggravates instability and prolongs cycles of violence. Breaking this cycle of violence requires strengthening policies of prevention and sustainable development. Mr. President, humanitarian access demands real political commitment. The Council must ensure that international humanitarian law is upheld and that the assistance reaches those who need it without delays. Likewise, the full implementation of humanitarian exemptions is fundamental to avoid personnel and supplies being stuck because of administrative procedures. Humanitarian agencies require security, predictability of financial resources that requires accelerating granting permits of access and protecting humanitarian infrastructure. The response to food insecurity also requires innovation and cooperation. Chile promotes sustainable and climate-resilient agriculture as well as policies of water management that strengthen food security. In situation of conflicts, these measures must be accompanied by the protection of essential infrastructure for the production and distribution of food to reduce vulnerability of communities and avoid the deterioration of livelihoods that becomes a factor of instability. As the President of Chile recalled last October during a statement in the FAO, ending hunger is the minimum common denominator of civilization that requires strengthening multilateralism, international cooperation, and sustainable transformation of food systems. Lastly, Mr. President, ensuring humanitarian access, cooperating with civilian population, reducing factors that aggravate vulnerability of communities are responsibilities that cannot be shifted or postponed. Chile reaffirms its conviction that if we act coherently, with a sense of responsibility, we can contribute in an effective way to alleviate the human suffering and sustain collective efforts for a lasting peace. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Chile for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Sierra Leone for this timely initiative and the briefers for their valuable insights. This session takes place at a time when the international community is still reeling from the harrowing images of induced hunger in the Gaza Strip, as well as unprecedented scale of the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and elsewhere on the African continent, among others. The security landscape in Africa is also characterized by the persistence of conventional security threats, including intrastate conflicts, such as insurgencies and conflicts involving terrorist groups. Challenges related to governance and corruption have resulted in poverty, underdevelopment, inequality, political and economic marginalization, and terrorism, compounded by climate change leading to mass displacement. The ongoing scramble for rare mineral resources is another area of concern involving states and non-state actors, such as transnational crime syndicates, which are leveraging new technologies in the fight for these resources, resulting in violent conflicts. Conflict limits access to food in various ways, while also disrupting the flow of food and humanitarian aid, thereby driving acute hunger. It further causes widespread displacement, and starvation is also used as a weapon of war. Infrastructure is damaged or destroyed during conflict, making it harder to plant, harvest, and transport food. Landmines and other remnants of war frequently leave farmland too dangerous to cultivate, thereby deepening hunger. Conflict also leads to food insecurity, which in turn further increases the chances of unrest and violence. While it is challenging to address food insecurity during ongoing conflict, various mechanisms, including the regional and at the sub-regional level, should be employed to diffuse tensions, mediate, and build and sustain peace. The good offices of the Secretary General need to be utilized to negotiate safe passage or corridors for humanitarian aid, a feat which is always challenging at the best of times, especially where civilian infrastructure has been damaged. However, community structures, mostly led by women involved in building peace at the local level, have proven to be instrumental in reaching vulnerable communities. Building partnerships with civil society and the private sector has led to the development of innovative solutions to access the most vulnerable sectors of the population. Youth have also leveraged new technologies to reach far-flung and isolated areas. Women's networks have further been instrumental, especially in building resilience to hunger through community-based projects with the support of governments in the absence of social security nets. They have proven to be resourceful in also documenting human rights violations and abuses that could ensure accountabilities in countries emerging from conflict. Working in a coherent manner, the United Nations agencies and programs have been critical partners given their expertise to raise alarm and also document human rights violations, including violations of international humanitarian law. Leveraging technology, Mr. President, including space technology for agricultural purposes is also important, such as predicting extreme weather conditions which impact the production of food. The need for humanitarian strategies to deal with disaster as part of national development plans play a key role. Finally, Mr. President, there's a need to build food systems that are adaptive, inclusive, sustainable, and resilient, diversifying and increasing the reliability of food sources, which necessitate integrating planning and adaptation in agricultural strategies. In this regard, we commend the latest iteration of the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program and the action plan, the Kampala Strategy and Action Plan 2026 to 2025, aimed at eliminating hunger and reducing poverty through economic growth and agricultural development. I thank you.
I thank the representative of South Africa for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Mr. President, Spain aligns itself with a statement of the Group of Friends of Action on Hunger and Conflict and would like to share some comments on a national capacity. The global situation of hunger is extremely alarming. According to the World Food Program, 70% of people who suffer acute food insecurity live in countries that have been fragilized or in conflict. This destruction of crops, disruption of markets, and displacement worsen a global crisis in places like Palestine and Sudan. In Gaza, there's a food disaster due to this destruction of infrastructure limits and access to humanitarian access. In Sudan, the recent taking of El Fasher has led the United Nations to declare a famine for the second time. And on the West Bank, the level of violence against farmers has reached unprecedented levels, while other crises are affecting the Middle East, Sahel, Latin America, and the Caribbean, especially Haiti and Colombia. International humanitarian law is clear. The use of hunger as a method of war is banned, as acknowledged in Resolution 2417 of this Council. Attacks against essential infrastructure, crops, as well as the blockading humanitarian aid has a devastating impact on food security. Spain would like to express its profound concern regarding the devastating link between armed conflicts and hunger. The Spanish strategy of humanitarian diplomacy addresses this scourge as one of its priority areas, and we're using our humanitarian diplomacy and international cooperation to fight against this. We demand full respect for international humanitarian law, allowing unrestricted access of humanitarian assistance in all contexts. We also demand accountability for violations of international humanitarian law. In the face of the increasing map of hunger around the world and the crisis of humanitarian financing, Spain has strengthened its humanitarian response through our Agency of Cooperation and Development. We've tripled our budget for humanitarian assistance for 5 years, in line with our law on sustainable development and global solidarity that establishes a goal of 0.7% of GDP in terms of ODA by 2030, including 10% of that figure for humanitarian aid. Our main humanitarian partner in the fight against food insecurity is the World Food Program. In 2025, we've disbursed some 16 million euros in voluntary contributions, including a contribution of 1.5 million euros to the logistical center of Las Palmas and the Canarias, which is key for operations in the Sahel and Western Africa. We also are cooperating with UNICEF, the Red Cross, and various Spanish NGOs in places like Haiti, Burkina Faso, the DRC, and Mali. Our commitment takes the form of concrete actions of multilateral cooperation, such as the support for the Regional Food Security Reserve of ECOWAS in Western Africa, which is a project that strengthens national and regional capacities to respond in the face of food crises through local, national, and regional reserves of food, thus complementing efforts of Member States. Mr. President, to conclude, to combat hunger and armed conflicts, we reaffirm our commitment to the defense of international humanitarian law, accountability, and multilateral actions. It's not only an issue of saving lives, but also protecting peace and human dignity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Spain for the statement. There are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m.